Welcome to this session of Reframing Museums. My name is Fiammetta Rocco. I am a senior editor at The Economist, focusing on culture. I'd like to start this session by saying a huge thank you to our hosts, Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Department of Culture and Tourism, and NYU Abu Dhabi for bringing us all together. Today, we're going to be talking about modeling the future, new business models beyond tourism and the blockbuster show. It's an area that, because of the pandemic, has become even more important than ever to anyone who is interested in museums and in culture generally. Now, before I introduce our panelists, let me just briefly tell you about how this session will unfold. First, each of the speakers will give a short presentation about how they see the museum sector at the moment from their different individual standpoints. Then we'll have a discussion about how we should be thinking about addressing the challenges that face us and the bigger challenges that lie ahead. And then towards the end, we will throw open the session to you, our audience. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions which we will put to the panel either individually or in groups. So here on behalf of our hosts is His Excellency Saud Al-Hosani, who in January this year, extraordinary prescient timing, was appointed the Acting Undersecretary of the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Mr. Al-Hosani has nearly 20 years' experience in strategy, planning, financial management across tourism, culture, media, tech solutions, financial services, and investment. So he really is a seasoned veteran in this field. Frédéric Jousset is a French entrepreneur and philanthropist. He's on the board of the Louvre in Paris and, crucially, has been appointed by the French government as the head of the working group developing the culture pass for young people. Dr. Max Hollein has been the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York since April 2018. And before that, was director of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, after having run a number of museums in Germany, including the Stedel Museum in Frankfurt, where he became known as a great fundraiser. Dr. Peter Keller is Director General of ICOM, the International Council of Museums, which gives him an almost unique global perspective on the museum sector. I'm going to call on His Excellency to be the first speaker.
Thank you, Fiammetta. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here on this occasion, marking the 3rd anniversary of Louvre Abu Dhabi. Definitely in my role as Undersecretary at the Department of Culture and Tourism Abu Dhabi, I view both tourism and culture as two sectors that are highly linked, contributed significantly to our economy. Before the pandemic, tourism was a key driver of economic outputs, contributing over 14% of national GDP. Abu Dhabi tourism specifically was on a steady rise over the past 10 years, reflecting a compound annual growth of 13% year over year. Similar to the Bilbao effect, the Abu Dhabi effect was very real in our area. Since the opening in November 2017, Louvre Abu Dhabi has greatly impacted our economy by attracting millions of visitors from around the world, attracting global partners, and driving our Emirates' goals in building diversified knowledge-based economy. Since the pandemic, various industries worldwide have been affected, including culture and tourism, which was ultimately testing all the cultural entities in the museum. We faced 3 main challenges. The first challenge is about reinstilling consumer confidence. We conduct several studies which shows a decrease in consumer confidence in visiting cultural sites. Reinstilling confidence in consumers is our primary concern at this time. Has led to several health and safety measurement and initiatives taking to help visitors feel safe visiting our cultural sites. These measures was included in the Go Safe certificate program, were led with the support of Abu Dhabi government and the health authorities, as well as on-site preventive measurements and protocols, like the partnership between Louvre Abu Dhabi and VBF Healthcare, where every visitor is met with a medical professional upon arrival. Another challenge is the access of the cultural content. As people remain concerned about visiting physical sites, this led us to launch major digital transformation efforts, such as Cultural Org platform, launched by Abu Dhabi Culture, providing access to our cultural content online, and that recognize the role that culture plays in promoting people well-being. In addition, Louvre Abu Dhabi launched 22 digital-based initiatives in the past 8 months to engage audience, despite the restrictions. The third challenge is made up of 2 parts: keeping our museum and cultural sites relevant to our audience. This is now becoming more relevant even ever this time. It will take tourism time to recover, and establishing hybrid business models that will enable development of sustainable cultural scene. We continue to look at ways to tackle these challenges, and we are grateful to our leadership for identifying culture and heritage as one of the priorities, national priorities within Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That's very interesting indeed. Now, Dr. Holein, you also come from a city where tourism is fundamentally important, even if the history and structure of your museum is quite different from Louvre Abu Dhabi. What's your view?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. Let me say first, of course, the Met, like any other institution of that kind and in a major city, is of course clearly affected by the current crisis. We have calculated that we will have a loss in revenue for this year and the next year of around $150 million, which comes out of loss of revenue through ticket sales, to fundraising galas, or the like. We obviously have reacted to that, and we had to reduce a certain level of our programming. We also had to reduce staff and had to do other measures. We can talk about that more. But what I would like to address is what I see as coming out of this. What have we experienced and what have we learned? I think, first of all, while we were closed and while museums have been closed around the world or are closing again, people are experiencing how much they need a museum. So when it's closed, it's basically no longer being taken for granted. So when we reopen, the amount of joy and excitement of our local audience, and of course, currently it's mainly a local audience, has been tremendous. So I think the validity of the museum and the desirability of having a museum in the vicinity has even kind of increased during this time. And I think that's something that we want to build on. The second element is something that also His Highness has already addressed. I think during this time of closure and coming out of it, we have all expanded the reach of the museum to our digital platforms. But I think also what has expanded is the understanding of the public, what a museum actually does. So it is actually not only a place that you can visit, but really a provider of education, of knowledge, of engagement, of scholarship, way beyond the physical parameter of the institution. So let's say from a funding perspective, I think it helped to basically show more transparent than before that a museum is a great provider of service, besides even the visit, of service to the society in many different aspects. Obviously, this time also lends to a time of reflection on what is really crucial, what is important for us to do. And I think we'll come out of that with a more focused idea of what kind of program, what kind of initiatives are important for a museum in the 21st century in that context. Finally, I want to see, I think museums are generally institutions of dialogue. They are institutions of cultural cross-currents. They are institutions of bringing people together, especially now in our current time where we see more and more nationalistic tendencies, where we see borders coming up, where we see travel restrictions in place. I think museums as platforms for dialogue and cultural exchange are more relevant than ever. And I think that's a great basis to build our future on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How interesting. So a distillation of opportunity rather than cause for despair. Now, Dr. Keller, you have, as Director General of Econ, probably the sharpest view of what, I mean, all individual museums will have had different individual experiences, but there will be patterns here, and you probably, better than anyone in the world, can give us a sense of what you see as the overarching patterns and themes of this year.
Peter, you're muted.
ICOM is the only association of museums and museum professionals in the world. So with 49,000 members in 140 countries almost. So we tried to get an overview when the pandemic started and launched 2 surveys. And I would like to give you some examples to give you an idea of the situation worldwide. Because when the lockdowns were decreed everywhere, they caused a profound disruption in the sector. In spring, almost all museums around the world were closed. In autumn, half of them were open. In some countries, they were still closed. That's in Latin America, for example. And in Europe, they closed again. The collections weren't affected because conservation and security had been ensured, but the economic impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns is substantial. Max Hollein already spoke about it. In the global perspective, 1/3 of the museums expect to lose more than half of their income, and especially in Asia, Africa, and the Arab region, they are affected. And of course, museums in tourist regions and those relying on earned income more affected than community museums or institutions receiving public funding. Therefore, the sector is downsizing. This is, of course, one way of dealing with the situation. 2/3 of the respondents of our surveys said that their museum will reduce programs. 14% of staff has already been furloughed or the contract not renewed. And in September, 6% said that they expect the museum to close permanently. In spring, the figure was higher, but it went down. And these figures are different in North America, Latin America, Asia, and the Arab region. They are considerably higher. For example, in North America, 2 or 3 times more staff has been furloughed or not renewed. And in the Arab region, 22% of the respondents expect their museums to close permanently. At the same time, museums are innovating. Again, at a global scale, the pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation. Half of the museums around the world increased their activities in social media, and 1/5 increased online access to collections, online events, and online learning programs. But as it was already said in the morning of this conference, in the future, museums will have to generate income from these activities to cover their losses, stabilize the business, and to create jobs. This is just to give you a short idea, and maybe later we can look into some details of the situation worldwide. Thank you.
Well, so a huge task ahead. Now, Monsieur Jousse, you're a good person to tell us exactly how that might be done, and I'm going to be counting on you for that because, of course, you have a great deal of experience having been a tech entrepreneur even before Google was invented. Tell us a little bit about what it looks like from the viewpoint of private sector entrepreneurial, philanthropic. You're somebody who marries everything together.
Well, thanks a lot. I remember Abu Dhabi. I was there with President Macron in 2017. What a great memory, but it feels like a century ago. Yeah, I mean, this is a major disruption. I believe in Chinese, crisis also stands for opportunity. So the two faces of the coin. Obviously, I'm going to bring some new figures from the Louvre, which I sit on the board. Each month, the Louvre loses 10 million euros. Ticketing is down 80%, corporate events down to 0. The Messines are not there anymore. I mean, the contracts they stick to, but for future engagements, it's very hard. And if we compare with the situation in 2015 with the terrorist attacks in Paris, what we know is that when the museums will reopen, they don't reopen at full capacity day one. It takes, a month to ramp up to pass visitorship and pass engagement from the community. So the ecosystem, the restaurants, everything, the licensed products, the libraries, I mean, they're going to be affected for years to come. Fortunately, the Louvre Museum is wholly subsidized by the French state. So no one has been furloughed, but I actually live in London, and in London, the situation is a bit more difficult. British Museum has furloughed 2/3 of its staff. Design Museum is closed, and I could go on and on and on. So it's an unprecedented magnitude that we see here. The way forward is definitely to reinvent the museums and the financing. The three pillars, events, sponsorship, and ticketing are not enough because there are going to be other pandemics, there are going to be other terrorist attacks, political movements, whatever you name that. You're refraining people from flying to other countries. So we need to invent sort of sustainable financing for the museums. And that's point A. And point B, we see the competition of other ways of experiencing arts. There's a great example of that in Paris called a company called Atelier des Lumières. They've created 3 digital centers where you can see paintings from Van Gogh. You could debate whether it's entertainment or education, and I agree it's probably halfway, but they attract 1.5 million visitors every year. And we'll see with more and more, the digital experience being better with 5G, with high-resolution cameras, with 8K drones, etc. There's a competition to museums looking forward. So I think they do need to reinvent themselves. But that's a very interesting age that we're, living through.
How interesting. More opportunity. Now, I just want to take a second to introduce our last panelist who has arrived, Professor Françoise Benhamou. Hi, Françoise. Professor Benhamou is an economist, a professor at Sorbonne Paris Nord University, and a specialist in cultural economics. She served for 6 years on the board of the Louvre in Paris, and last December brought out her latest book, Économie du patrimoine culturel, Economy of Cultural Patrimony. Now, her book is about a great deal more than just economy. Professor, tell us a little bit about how it looks from your point of view.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for joining so late. I had a problem with connection.
Not at all. You're here now. That's the important thing.
I think we can't discuss the question of the future of museums and especially of their, what I can call their business model, without dealing with the consequences of the crisis. And the first point is that the crisis increases or highlights in existing trends. And the first one is globalization, of course. And globalization has several aspects. The first one is tourism. In Paris, for example, 75% of visitors are tourists, foreign tourists. And at this time, of course, they cannot come to Paris. And this is the same problem in all the capitals in all around the world. This implies a permanent competition in order to attract tourism, and tourism should be a source of revenues, direct through the purchase of tickets, but also indirect for gift shop purchases and for the ecosystem of the museum. And the second point linked to globalization is the growing competition, which is in force when museums want to enrich their collections. And this can be a problem. And we met that even with the Louvre at the beginning when the Louvre Abu Dhabi wanted to buy new works of art. And this is a problem through the nation's gifts purchases on the international art market. And in the framework of the pandemic, the stop at globalization does not stop this need for revenues, but stops the source of revenues that come from tourism. So we have to invent something that should be new. My second point is a rise in strategies from a long time based on events. This implies a rise in costs and search for revenues, for new revenues, with possibly a rise in prices. At a risk, the first risk, of course, is standardization with exhibitions that travel all around the world. And my second point is a drop in democratization. And this raises the question of the cooperation between museums and, once again, the need for revenues in order to cover the increasing cost of exhibitions, insurance, transport, etc. And I would add a need to find a way for the public with highest incomes to subsidize in a certain way the public with lowest revenues. My third point linked to the crisis is the awareness of the civil society and governments about the role of museums for the ecosystem and for local economies. And in the context of the pandemic, the idea is to be more modest, to be more local. And this can mean a fall in quality in order to be less costly. And this is a very important question. And my fourth point is that the present pandemic raises a question of digitization, of course, as Frédéric discussed this point before. And digitization allows distant access. Maybe it's very discussed. It's a tool for democratization, but in many cases, there are no business models. Of course, Frédéric Jousset found a model for a certain type of museums, digitized museums. But when we think, for example, of the big investment of the biggest museums in digitization, I'm not sure there is a business model behind their investments behind their investment. And therefore, there is a propensity to ask Google to create a kind of global museum. And this function should be the function of museums and not of Google. Therefore, we need, and I will finish with that, new models of financing in order to find new models of financing, I think we have to search a balance, a new model, a new balance between conservation missions on the one side and what I can call business strategies. A new balance between events and exhibitions based on blockbusters and more scientific and more maybe narrow topics for exhibitions. A new balance between local and global logic. And I would add a new balance between digitized access and physical access. And I think these are the challenges for tomorrow.
Thank you. Gosh, well, everybody has their work cut out for them, not least to be able to fend off Google. But at the base of it is money. So let's start on the finances. I mean, it's clear that the three drivers of globalized museums, as you've all said, whether it's tourism or blockbuster exhibitions, private and corporate funding, all of these have really been hit at the knees by the pandemic. Drop of attendances, cancellation of exhibitions, a freeze on loans, pressure on funding. As Mr. Juchet told us, the Louvre is losing 10 million euros a month, but they are a subsidized museum, and this will be refunded by the state. The 80 million euros that they will lose this year will be refunded to them, and no one has been furloughed. At the Met, Dr. Hollein talks about losses of $150 million over 2 years. Met's one of the museums that will certainly recover, but many museums in other countries don't have that luxury. So for those that depend on private and corporate philanthropy, or have the sort of mixed system like there is in Britain, where you get a little bit of state funding, but you've been encouraged really to match every pound you raise with another pound you get from government with another pound raised. How can those museums recover financially? Max, why don't we start with you, and perhaps you can tell us how you're doing it, and I'm sure others will learn from your example.
Well, obviously we are in a, to a certain extent, luxurious position. We have an endowment that supports the institution, an endowment of $3.4 billion, of which a significant part of that can be used for operational costs. So obviously that's kind of a financial basis that allows
how much, can I just stop you for a second? How much income does that give you a year?
Well, it's obviously if you take a 5% kind of cut, you can see that income is significant. I mean, not all of it can be used for operational costs, but I would say that through the endowment, through philanthropy and others, we get about $200 million a year that we can use for operational costs through that. So I think that we have that. I think we have to be mindful that the biggest cost for museums, no matter how many shows you do or how less shows you do, is the staff, is personnel cost. I don't know what the numbers are at the Louvre, but I would say at the Met, it's 65 to 70% of our cost is staff. So in a sense, I think it is really crucial to make sure that there is, both from a philanthropic understanding, but maybe also from a governmental understanding, is really a better understanding of what the museum does for society and at large, and kind of how you expand that perception. I would say that the focus on the visitor as a possible or main source of income is a very dangerous one, because I think all the kind of revenue streams or revenue proposals that have been developed for that, be that retail, restaurants, whatever, they are also all dependent on the visitation, right? So it's basically, you see that whole system shrinking right now. I think it's much more important that you as an institution really are not only very connected to your local audience, but that you also amplify the role that you play, both locally, but then also internationally, as a provider of service, as a provider of experience, as a provider of education. And to a certain extent, I think that means that the support that you will get from philanthropy is significant in that context. I also think that digitally, we are a major provider of all sorts of digital offers. I think that what it allows us is to scale actually even more than before our offerings and to disseminate it even more broadly. I don't think that the end customer, so to say, of our offerings should be the one paying for it. I think it basically, we are scaling our offerings so that like foundations, other sources that can support us, see the impact that we are having with that and continue to support these efforts. I think we have to just be very careful about thinking that, so to say, the end customer, meaning the visitor or the recipient of a digital offering, should be the core source of our revenue. I think that would come with a lot of risk and also with a lot of challenges in regard to accessibility and in regard to the understanding also of an institution being a non-profit organization and a provider of basically of services for society.
How interesting. So the view from a very successful museum. Dr. Keller, I'd like to bring you in here because, of course, as you said, you are the head of an organization that has 49,000 members in 140 countries. This is not going to be the experience of most of the museums in Econ. So how can they recover financially, the ones who don't have the size or the grandeur or the appeal or the history of somewhere like the Met?
Let me speak about the situation first before speaking about strategies again, because we see that museums that receive public funding are more resilient now than those depending on private funding. And these museums, depending on private funding, are more likely to reduce opening hours and staff. And there is a difference of course, from country to country. In the US, where museums are more privately funded, the American Association expects even 30% of the museums to close, whereas this figure is in Europe much lower. But in Europe, the public budgets will shrink later when the costs of the pandemic has to be covered. So the first need is public support or financial aid to overcome this first moment of the crisis. We had developed advocacy tools to help museums to convince local or regional or national authorities to include the museum sector in COVID-19 response policies, and underlining the key role of museums in local development. But in the medium term, there have to be new business models, online models. I think newspapers were in a similar situation 10, 15 years ago when they had to make their online activities profitable. And they gain from online presence now. And museums will have to shift the focus from blockbuster exhibitions to other forms of useful collection, online experiences, hybrid experience maybe, which can help to find public. But you have to say at the same time, there is a difference regarding museums. Big museums depending on tourism, like the Louvre, have lost 80% of the visitors, but regional museums only lost maybe 30 or 40% of their visitors, so are less concerned. And the small community museums are even less concerned. They had less income before, of course, but they lost less income as well.
Gosh, well, I mean, the thing is that politically, the stance on state funding is not going to go the museum's way in most countries. France, in Germany, in Austria, where you come from, that's very important, but that is quite a small minority of countries. And I don't know what you feel, but I don't see that changing really in the museum's favor. And to cite the newspaper industry as something to look at is coming from the newspaper industry. I can tell you that the view for the last 10 years has been quite an unhappy one, a lot of funerals. Professor Benhamou, tell us a little bit about how you would, I'd like to make a contrast between France and countries where they have a different model. How do you see it develop in France? the question particularly about financial recovery.
Yes, in France, the state and also the local authorities are very pay much attention to culture, even if some people say it's not enough. Of course, we subsidize the museums, and even we subsidize private places somewhat. But I don't think the state will be able to cover all the loss of the big museums that whose revenues rely on tourism. And this museum will have to think a new kind of programmation and maybe a new strategies for 2-3 years before recovering. And my second point is to say that, more generally speaking, the disaster, if I can speak like that, is higher when you depend not only on tourism, but when I would say when you are middle-sized museums, I think the small museums, very linked to local logics, will survive. Maybe with difficulties, but they will survive. And there will be a kind of polarization. The very big museum will survive, of course. We are not going to close the Musée du Louvre, etc. But in the middle of both of them, the difficulties will be higher. And many museums depend on local authorities that want to help, but that will have many investment to do, and that will face many social questions. And I'm not sure culture will be at the highest level of the hierarchy of expenses for local authorities.
So what's interesting about the pandemic, and not just with regard to museums, but with regard to so many other things, literary festivals, which I'm involved in, all sorts of stuff, is that it's actually, none of it has been a huge surprise. It's just accelerated trends that were happening anyway. So if we're talking about short-term and long-term changes that museums need to implement, not just to survive, but in order to thrive, I'd like to bring in His Excellency here and perhaps Monsieur Jousset afterwards for different views. You hold the balance of different views. Your Excellency, give us the view from the Louvre Abu Dhabi, from the Gulf. What are the short-term and long-term changes that you've been thinking about and talking about for Louvre Abu Dhabi to thrive?
As we are talking now, we are in a recovery phase. And it's only since inception, as it is a pioneering museum in a local community. Our focus on our local community has always been a priority. Engaging with the community, engaging with the education ecosystem is a priority for us. So on the recovery phase, we'll be focusing on the local communities. And for a long term, definitely our recovery plans will be aligned with the tourism recovery plans.
Monsieur Jousset, you have an interesting viewpoint, because you see both London and Paris, which are not very far apart, at least physically, but really quite different in this. What do you see as the tough short-term and long-term changes that museums need to implement in order to thrive?
I think they need to little bit revamp the operating model to focus on activities to engage the audience and to engage with more activities maybe relevant to the young communities, not by necessarily related to the museums. There is certain programs could generate certain revenue streams, could support the funding model of the museum, and also ensure the engagement of the community and the tourists as well.
I want to come back to the engagement of young audiences in a second, but Monsieur Jousset, let's have your view of what you think the hard changes, really hard decisions, short-term and medium-term decisions that museums need to take in order to thrive in the future.
Well, I think the hardest bit has already been taken. It's behind us. As Max Allein said, I mean, there's not much to optimize costs in the museum, and pretty much everything is fixed. So the challenge is more to invent new streams of revenues. And that's, I'd say that the change of paradigm to switch from being artwork-centric to being customer-centric. And if I be a little bit provocative on this one, the challenge is that museums are mostly directed by people in their mid-50s to young 60s who have started their career in the 70s, 80s, where digital didn't exist, after very long and intensive art history studies. And they're not run by tech entrepreneurs. So this is the challenge, to sort of reinvent yourself when your career, and a very successful career to get to where you've been, has been, more or less, pretty much in the art world. When we see the challenges are going far beyond. So just to bring some ideas, what the future could look like. If you think of the museums, the good news is they have plenty of great assets. The first one, obviously, is the brand. If you think of the Met, Beaubourg, British Museum, the Louvre, the awareness is global. Everyone knows the Louvre. And it's not only awareness, it's also credibility that comes along with. So there's plenty of licensing things that the museums could do with their brands, starting with advertising. The Louvre has started a campaign with DS. It's a brand from Peugeot on the Chinese world. There's the launch in China. And so the whole campaign has been shot around the pyramid of the Louvre. And that has kick-started the launch of DS in China. So this is, I guess, one area. The second thing is, in terms of know-how, they have a lot of know-how that they could sell. They could invent some consulting services, because the statistics we have is that in the next decade, sort of 5,000 museums, private art centers, private museums will open. And all these monuments, all these places to be open will need to piggyback on the expertise of museums which have been there since 19th or 18th century. So this is another area where there's potential stream of revenues. I'd say a third thing, obviously, is on derivative products, licensed products. Again, licensing the brand to do whatever fancy based on an image of quality, of creativity, of art that you could invent. This is something the film industry has done very well, but you guess the museum industry could replicate this. So, and then, the taboo, but I think we're going to have to break some of the taboos. The Louvre lends every year 2,500 pieces of art, mostly for free. I'd say 95% of them. Louvre Abu Dhabi was actually the first sort of paying cooperation, which has been very fruitful for both ends. Louvre Abu Dhabi is an amazing start, and I think everyone was very happy with that, and has created streams of revenue for the Louvre, has enabled us to build the first endowment fund that we didn't have, unlike the American museums. So now we have sort of 130 million. So it's just a starting point versus the 3.4 billions, but it's a good start. So cooperating and lending pieces against money, we're going to have to see that more and more, at least for the rich museums, because that's one way to create a stream of revenues. And I'd say, finally, in maybe another taboo, which is we have 70,000 square meters of the Louvre. The collections, I mean, what is underground is about 350,000 artworks, and what is exhibited is 35,000. It's roughly 10%. The layout of the collections hasn't changed much since ages, actually. Is there room to think, when you track the visitorship inside the Louvre, everything, the hallway, the major hallway around the Gioconda, Mona Lisa, is jammed with people, and you have places of the Louvre which are totally empty. Is there a way to invent activities which are more money-making, potentially, and then you could think of, places where we could alternate the display of permanent collections. So reshuffle the layout of the museums. That's also maybe something that will have to be investigated in the future. These are some ideas.
Oh, interesting. Well, that shows up one thing, which is competition, cooperation. I mean, museums are facing already in their quest for visitors, exhibition loans, funding. How should they manage the tension between those two things? I know, Professor Benhamou, you have some thoughts about the sort of, how do you manage the thing between competition and cooperation? Françoise, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, that's okay.
Very sorry.
I agree with what Frédéric Jousset told, but it's only for big museums with brands. And of course, our problem is to create an ecosystem of museums with some of them that create a kind of leverage effect for the others. And that's a big deal. And to answer to the question of this tension that can exist between cooperation and competition, I think both must exist. Competition is good if it is fair competition. It is a kind of it helps building strategies. The problem is to find the right balance, and this balance depends on principles. And I think that we should not forget that museums, the collections in museums, in a certain way belong to everybody. They belong to what we call common goods. And this should not be forgotten by museums when they try to create more valorization, more commodification of their works of art. They should not forget that point. And so the balance is to define around principles, ethic principles, and also to be aware of the idea that some museums cannot pay for loans. So they need loans and not paying loans, if I can speak like that. So, and I would add one thing that seems for me very important. It is that we face a new philosophy, a new paradigm, maybe for the next years, with the idea to program exhibitions and loans that come from collections. Sylvie Ramon had an expression that I think very, very clear. She said that the new philosophy is not to conceive exhibition that are a sum of international war treasures, but as an augmented interpretation of the permanent collection. And this point is very interesting because maybe it's a way to cope with this tension between cooperation and competition, to rely more on permanent collections. Sorry.
I'd like to add something to this. First of all, I think it was really great to hear both what Frédéric just pointed out in regard to some of the important measures. I mean, I think that's spot on in a lot of the cases, and obviously everybody's working on that. And of course, also what Francois said. I think what I want to point out, what happened during this current phase of the crisis is there is a much stronger solidarity between museums right now. I mean, through this crisis, there's a way more significant collaborative spirit to kind of jointly help each other. So I think that kind of is something that obviously is always useful and helpful, and we want to kind of move that forward, even when we come out of the crisis. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't pursue some of the things that Frédéric has mentioned, but I think it's also an important element to this. The other piece, of course, during this crisis is efficiency. Efficiency increased for sure. I mean, certainly being in lockdown is not efficient, but museums kind of looked at their processes and made them a bit more efficient. I would even say that this symposium probably is more efficient than what we would have done a year ago. We would have all traveled to Abu Dhabi, which would be great, and we would also have loved to see the Louvre again. But in this case, obviously, it was easy for us to do. There are no travel costs involved. So I think, so in a certain sense, a lot of our activities become more efficient and maybe less cost sensitive. Also the way how we currently, if we are able to kind of send loans around, it kind of is changing right now. I think one element that is really important, and I think that, again, also Frédéric pointed to that, is I think he called it thinking about the customer. Obviously, this is language that, as a museum director, you're not using generally, but I think the idea behind that is we need to further improve our ability also for storytelling, about our ability to really create great and engaging narratives that do engage different people. And I think also we talked about also Abu Dhabi and the local audience and about younger audiences. Again, it's kind of thinking about that audience and what kind of stories, what kind of narratives are we going to provide to be engaging. I think that's another crucial element to that. Again, it's more like a soft factor. You cannot calculate that immediately, but I think that's something that also museums have been doing or have been learning, but I think it's accelerated. And as you said, Fiametta, a lot of the things that we are doing right now that we need to tackle have been with us as challenges already before the pandemic, and as many other things, the pandemic just accelerates these matters or even puts a stronger focus on and urgency on them, which I think at the end of the day is also healthy. Yeah.
If I can jump in at this stage.
Jump in, go on.
Yeah, sorry, I fully agree with Max Online. I think when we speak about a customer-centric industry, I think there's a big area for improvement for museums, which is admission price. The admission price is sort of universal price, fixed price, 15 euros for the Louvre. I don't know how much is it for the Met, $20, $25?
Yeah, 25. Yeah, 25. But it's pay
25.
what you wish for local.
Yeah, and it's and you pay it whether you spend 5 minutes or you spend a full day. You spend it whether you're rich or poor. You pay it whether you live in New York City or you live in Japan. And the sensitivity has never been analyzed. Obviously, if you're a Chinese visitor, you've paid your plane ticket $1,000 plus your room £300, whatever currency. Are you not going to visit the Louvre because it's $30? Of course not. You're going to pay $30. And if you come from a suburb near Paris, I mean, that's a lot of money. That's way too much money. So we're going to have to invent yield management to create differences where if you want to visit the Louvre, the Met, and have less people and a better experience, then you have to pay for it, like, for airlines. If you want to be seated comfortably, you have the business class and you pay for it. And these are the taboos, This is going to be a big shake, in the cultural world, because now it's one size fits all. But I think these are the things looking forward, which makes no sense, especially with the pre-booking over the internet. So you can choose your experience. We know by definition that museums are cyclical. There is seasonality. There are ways to find, an enriched way of visiting the museum at a higher price.
That's so interesting. We've got about 5 minutes before the Q&A session, and I just want to broaden this out philosophically a little bit, because and it was a point that Dr. Holland made to me the other day when we were chatting, which is that young audiences, young people don't want to just visit museums. They want to feel that they are part of their world. They want to feel that they share certain values. And a lot of young people all over the world are calling for greater equality, for greater social justice. What does this mean for museums who have to contend with bodies of activists who are calling for the restitution of colonial objects, for example, or for greater transparency in fundraising? Dr. Holland, you haven't had so much of, you're not at the sharp end of demands for colonial restitution, but transparency in fundraising, that's certainly been an issue at the Met.
Yeah, I think it's, as you say, I would say that we are experiencing a great success through this, meaning that museums have opened up, and it's about accessibility. It's about an audience not only feeling that they visit something, but an audience that feels it's part of the institution, that the institution is, so to say, so strongly connected to them that there's an expectation that the institution itself not only respects their values, but represents the values of the audience. And that, I think, is on the one hand a great thing, because it obviously shows the strong cohesion and connectivity that the museum is not only something remote that you visit, but something that kind of is part of your life, and you want to see it as your home away from home. On the other hand, of course, it makes you as an institution having to be responsive and also having to be more transparent and addressing some of the issues that come at you. All of that is still often part of a debate, a discussion, a conversation, sometimes even a negotiation, because it needs to be kind of surfaced in a sometimes even more complex way to respond. But it is something that I consider very healthy, and also something that I feel is a strong fundament for the museum of the 21st century. If we are talking about a younger audience, I think that younger audience will be won over, not only by great programming, but by being an institution that everyone wants to really be associated with and wants to feel it's their institution on a number of fronts, not only about
let me just bring in His Excellency here quickly, because of course the youth element for Abu Dhabi and for the conception of Louvre Abu Dhabi was absolutely fundamental.
Definitely, all museums have responsibility to ensure equality and social justice. The advantage of Louvre Abu Dhabi is that it is telling the stories of global stories, and therefore, by definition, inclusive and uniting.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to throw open the floor now to the questions which are pouring in from the other attendees. And I want to start with chucking one in, which will shake everybody up. From Noah Haim, what can museums learn from Netflix? Can they envision a similar model for culture?
I can start maybe, but Frederic and others might have more. I think what we can learn from Netflix is that Netflix, while it's a global service, is very local. It really drills deep into local cultures and produces products, so to say, in this sense, movies that are often rooted within a local community. So in a sense, it is a global product, but it allows various different cultural voices to surface. And I think that I find most interesting. And so what Netflix did in the last maybe like 2 years, when it became really this enormous enterprise, is really that we are now looking at, I don't know, TV series from Iceland and the next thriller from Norway or whatever, and it basically, and you can see these cultural differences there, and I think that's something that's really powerful and strong and increases curiosity. So to see the locality in the global is something that I think Netflix uses very well.
Well, we're all stuck on the ground.
If I may jump in.
Yes, Dr. Keller.
Yeah, I think Netflix made films more accessible and available. You don't have to go to cinema. You don't have to wait until 8 o'clock every Tuesday until you see your favorite series. And this is something museums can do by increasing online access to their collections and developing online exhibitions. But there is one point I'm wondering about, and I don't have the answer, because the museum very much relies on the authenticity of the object. It's one of the values the museum represents, and you cannot transmit this authenticity online. So there is a kind of contradiction, I think, where I don't see where the museum can, without giving up this value, make collections or exhibitions more accessible online.
Well, except that digitization is so much part of the future, so much part of the present, and is going to be so much bigger. I have another question from Rima Hosani. It's true that digitalization of museums and exhibitions expanded the circle of knowledge exchange, and it is in itself a mode of online tourism. Very true. However, are we actually expanding the circle to include more diverse peoples, or just inviting more privileged people?
I can jump on this one based on the Louvre and Versailles. We see the online visitorship growing in parallel, a bit faster, obviously, because now we have 18 million visitors for the Louvre yearly versus 10 million in 2019. But it's so we see for the first time people visiting the website of the Louvre just for the sake of it, without the intention to come and prepare the visits or to keep a souvenir of the visits. So we see sort of a decoupling between the online experience and the physical experience, which is great because by definition, internet is ubiquitous. So it gives everyone a chance to go and see the collection. And I'd say, and in fairness to the Louvre, that the website doesn't do justice to the physical experience. I think it's lagging far behind. We're preparing a new version. And I think there's a time where, they'll have more technology people in the staff of the museums, and where, it would get closer to Google Arts and Culture. And I see that as a chance and not as a replacement.
Mm-hmm.
I would add that the video clip by Beyoncé and Jay-Z that was made with the Louvre was seen by 228 million people. So I think it's a kind of visit. Of course, these people will not go necessarily to the Louvre, but they saw the blockbuster pieces of the Louvre and other works of art. So I think it's interesting. There is no opposition between digitization and physical visit. I think they are complementary.
But very interestingly enough, when you look at the annual reports of the British Museum of the Louvre, the noble visits for them is still the physical visit. So you have 4 pages which breaks down who on the physical side, where do they come from, what is their rate of satisfaction, etc., etc. And you have only 2 lines on the virtual visits, where you could spend a lot more, again, the focus and details to analyze what sort of visitorship, time spent, galleries, online galleries visited. But you see this hiatus between the 2 perceptions.
Well, that speaks directly to what you were saying before about the age of the people who run museums. This hadn't caught up yet. But let me throw open another idea. So Elisa Bernard has sent a question about authenticity, which is also part of this discussion. So virtual reality tools, 3D modeling, VA and AR, inform and foster the narrative surrounding objects and contexts, but might or might not they also risk compromising the aesthetic and cognitive experience of the original object or sites? Although offering a glimpse to the pristine identity of the objects, don't AR and VR stay in the limbus between reality and fiction? Should they be handled with care?
That's the very old question. has been raised by Walter Benjamin in 1936. So it
it's a
goes
good
back
one
a long
then,
time
and
ago.
it's still a good one now.
We had the same debate with the emergence of photography. Was the same debate. The molding in the 19th century. Yeah, I think it's an old debate. I mean, it's Max Hollein to respond to that. What's your view on that?
Well, I think you're right. It's exactly the same thing that happened with photography, or even with catalogs when they got published, and people said, well, this would kind of almost like draw the attention away from the original object. I think that especially AR has a huge potential for us, both on-site as well as off-site, to really augment our storytelling and the understanding of some objects. It will not necessarily kind of change the aesthetic of our display or the ability to experience the original, but it will enhance and amplify the opportunities to experience something in addition and beyond that, that sometimes gives you the more proper context and the broader understanding of where not only where that object came from, but also how it actually fit into originally a very different context. Just think about polychromy in the antique arts and what you can do to show that actually white marble sculptures looked very different 1,000 years ago, or that you show that all of medieval and a lot of Renaissance sculpture was actually were not singular objects, but were part of a whole building ensemble. So I'm not saying that we will kind of change necessarily the display per se, but I think especially augmented reality will allow you to kind of add a layer of experience and of understanding that I think we have been missing, and that you cannot just show really well with a chat panel or with a text. I think there an image speaks very strongly.
Françoise Benhamou, I know you wanted to join in there. You're on mute.
When I say it's complementary, it's very important to have this in mind. For example, when you see the case of cinemas, when with screens, some people thought that the cinema theaters would disappear. And now, for example, in France, we have 200,000 million people going to cinema each year. So the more you are on your computer, and the more you need also to see the reality, to go out, and we see that with the pandemic. And I think that point is very important. Museums have to work on their two on the two faces of the market, if I can say, speak like that, physical and virtual.
Absolutely, and Hanan Worrell, who I know is in the audience, says, while experiencing collections in person is special, the recent film the Louvre Abu Dhabi released on the collection and narrative on the occasion of its 3rd anniversary was brilliant. It was quite comfortable and enjoyable to learn more about the collection from the comfort of our own home. Telling stories about the collection via film and moving image can be very engaging. Well, that's certainly been the experience of opera, of all sorts of other things. But François Jousset, let me ask you about something here, which is, in this year of pandemic, audiences have been incredibly forgiving of online efforts that have been made either by museums or theatres or operas or book festivals. A lot of that has been free to audiences. How do you monetize it?
Well, as panelists said before, I mean, there is no, for now, not a museum, to my knowledge, has advertising on the websites. I think it would be a bit of a struggle, or it would have to be very qualitative, and it would be quite minor, given the stakes, that would need to be financed. So I think I'm not sure online advertising would be a source of revenue for museums. I don't see that. Maybe education, what the MoMA is doing, that's pretty interesting. They're doing an online course for contemporary art, which is for free, But if you pass and you want your certificate, you have to pay $40 to be able to share that on LinkedIn or social networks. I think that is the potential stream of revenues.
Well, that's interesting. So here's a question from Max Hollein, following on from that, from Naomi Ray. What is your response to some of the taboo-breaking revenue-generating ideas proposed by Monsieur Jousset?
I think none of them are completely taboo-breaking. I think that they need to be looked at and pursued in a certain way. I think that I think Frederic mentioned basically using the brand, so basically a licensing of the brand. That's happening already, and I think so. If done well, I think it can actually enhance also not only the awareness about the institution, but actually also can create another framework. Also, the idea of consulting is something that I think yes will continue, and to a certain extent we are doing already. I have to say that even partly that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of people coming to our visiting committees, private collectors who come to our visiting committees to see what the museum is doing, to learn a bit about maybe what they should collect or what we are thinking. So there's some of that is already happening, a certain like soft form as well. I think that the things that are a bit more complicated is the I don't know how Frederic framed it, the reshuffling of the space and maybe kind of allocating space for different purposes, some of it commercial. That's what I understood. I think that's something that's not something that's not neither very easily to be accomplished, nor probably something that very desirable for us. But I think that there are numerous aspects to that. In regard to a differentiated pricing model, I have to see that the Met has that. Because as you might know, New Yorkers come into the Met with a pay what you wish policy. So it basically is total accessibility. Whatever you can afford, you should pay and you come in. People outside of the state of New York and also internationally, they pay the price. But again, here, I think, yes, pricing models will get more refined, especially through online ticketing. I can see all of these things already happening one way or the other, and we need to pay attention to them.
How fascinating. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I think the great lesson to take away is how deeply embedded museums are in our sense of ourselves as human beings, how much they bring us together, how much they teach us, how much they refresh our lives. And that's really a wonderful, wonderful thing to see. Thank you to our panel of speakers. Thank you to the Louvre Abu Dhabi, to NYU Abu Dhabi, and particularly for the team who have worked around them so much to make this online offering a success. And of course, last but not least, thank you to you, our audience. We had as many as 130 people at some point. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.